Good afternoon, everybody. Welcome to Office Hours. As Laura said, we are going to talk about floating action buttons today. My name is Chris McMeeking, Mobile Accessibility Lead here at Deque Systems, member of the W3C Mobile Accessibility Task Force, yada, yada, yada. And let's get started. Let's see, there we go. Office Hours. So if you have not attended before, basically the agenda is some quick announcements, anything that's going on, any efforts here at DQ, or for those who license our products, things coming up. And then a topic, floating action buttons is the topic today. Super interesting topic. And then open Q&A. My goal is to discuss the topic for about 15 minutes to a half an hour, but to leave the bulk of the time for questions and answers at the end. With that said, let's go to announcements. Announcement, Global Accessibility Awareness Day, just a few days ago, was super awesome. I went out to the Bay Area, had a great chat with the Bay Area Mobile Accessibility Meetup. Thank you, Salesforce, for having us there, and LinkedIn and Airbnb for being so hospitable and all of the above. That was really a great experience. I actually gave parts of the talk that I'm going to give today there. Attest 2.0 is coming out by next office hours. By this time next month, we will have likely released that. Depends on when office hours falls. I talked with Laura about that before. We'll share that date at the end. And then Axe for Android mobile app updates will be coming along with that, as well as hopefully releasing the iOS corresponding bits and pieces. So floating action buttons. All right, floating action buttons. Why are floating action buttons a problem for accessibility? What is so confusing? Why are floating action buttons a challenge when it comes to accessibility? So let's talk about floating action buttons and make sure that we're on the same page regarding this design pattern first. So a quick generalization of what a floating action button is. A floating action button is an actionable thing that kind of floats down usually in the bottom right. I think Gmail icons when you're in your Gmail app. And no matter where you're at within Gmail, there's this button at the bottom that just says kind of compose, or when you're on your email page, no matter where you're at in that list of emails that you have, there's this action floating in the bottom right corner that allows you to compose an email whenever you would like. Why are they a challenge for accessibility? So floating action buttons are difficult for accessibility for many reasons. Some of those we're going to explore, but the main reason that developers run into floating action button problems is that button. Let's pretend like that button is in the middle of the screen right here. That button is going to be at the bottom of the accessibility hierarchy. So it's going to be the last thing. When you have an accessibility node info, or when you're talking views in iOS, that floating action button is going to be the last thing in that view. And if this content here, as it is usually used, if this content is a list view and you are scrolling up that list view, let's say that you have talkback focus and you're swiping right? You're swiping right on your phone and talkback focus is going down that list. Elements of the bottom portion of that list are going to start rendering before you get focused to that thing. So a few different things can happen, and there can be a few different default behaviors depending on the device that you're on. One is that floating action button could potentially be focused as focus is going from here to here to here to here, jumps to the action button down, which isn't terrible. It works. The other thing that can happen is the floating action button can be the last thing that's focused. And that's really bad, because if you have a list of, let's say, 1,000 emails, that floating action button is never going to be focused. And there's a lot of different ways we can fix this problem, and how we fix this problem depends on the nature of the floating action button, what it represents and things like that. So let's talk a bit about the different types of floating action buttons, or rather let's try and conceptualize exactly what a floating action button represents to people with disabilities. All right, so here, let me see if I can do this cool pointer thing. I discovered this feature. So sorry you have to deal with me playing around with this cool laser pointer, because I discovered this the other day and it's fun. So instead of having the mouse, you get this red dot and it zips. This is cool. All right, so this is a single view application. And notice I mocked it up, and I have these little boxes here, right? And so we have a single view application. We don't know what its app name is. It's chilling out up here. There's a level 1 heading of some kind up at the top, but we don't know what that is. There's an infinite list, or at least it looks like an infinite list right now, right? We have these 4 boxes. They're all identical, and there's this one little box hanging down here that we can kind of partially see. Point being that there is a thing. There are more items on this list than are completely visible, right? But that's all we can really tell right now. We've censored a lot of information. We don't know what's going on here. All we know is that there is a list of items, and finally a fab, right? There's this fab button down here, and this fab button presumably does something, but we don't really know. There's very little context for this application with this amount of censoring. So let's go on to the next step. Have we changed your perception of this view at this point, right? We have gained a little bit more information by uncensoring those list cells, but by allowing us to see the shape of that content. We know that this is now class 2 information. These look a lot like subheadings, right? There's not little details in there. It's not like in Gmail, right? You open up Gmail, and when you see the list contents in Gmail, you have like a subheading at the top, and then there's content, right? And there's little bits, there's previews and things like that. That's not what we have. What we have are subheadings. There's some type of list item here, and so we have a title. We still have a potentially infinite list, but there are 4 items visible, and the fab button is still as disguised as it was, and hasn't given us any additional context yet. So let's go to the next step. All right. So at this point, we should start having an understanding of what this application is. In fact, anybody familiar with the Sandusky area is going to have a very good idea of what this application does, although maybe not quite, right? There's clearly some information here. But so what we've done is we've uncensored that level 2 information, and so we have app name is still a question mark. But we know this is a finite list now, and that's an important piece of information, that this is not infinite and this is finite. That's very important from an accessibility perspective. And now we have 4 visible items: Millennium Force, Top Thrill, Raptor, Maverick. I hope that there is somebody in the audience that knows at least approximately what this application is at this point. But let's go on to the next step real quick. Cedar Point. So I'm sure a lot of people knew that, but these are rides at Cedar Point, right? So now what this screen looks like is Cedar Point at the top, Millennium Force, Top Thrill, Raptor, Millennium. Oops, there's I change that. That should be a different ride. That should be like Maverick or something like that, which, by the way, Maverick is one of my favorite Cedar Point rides. But we still don't know what this application does, right? We could start guessing. I gave this presentation for Global Accessibility Awareness Day, and the guesses I got at this point were like, get information about a ride, or rate a ride, or kind of list your favorite rides, right? And those are all good guesses, but not ultimately what I intended this application to be, right? And so picture as a talkback user right now, this in all of those default ways that you could mark this up for accessibility. The most common default way that that's going to be handled, especially in Android, is for this fab button to be focused last, right? And so as a non-sighted user, this is the view that we get, this Cedar Point Millennium Force just dropping down, right? And you're lacking that context. So we go on to the next one, and this becomes a navigation icon. suddenly the purpose of this application becomes clear, right? And we no longer need to kind of guess back here about what this application does. When we take this floating action button and change it to a navigation icon, the purpose of this application becomes apparent. And so user navigating, when did the purpose of this application become clear? At what point did the purpose of this application become apparent? And that's when the floating action button began. When we got to that, when we exposed that floating action button, the purpose of this as like a navigation aid for getting around Cedar Point, that was the only thing that clued us into why this was. And I've seen applications marked up like this before where you have that kind of primary level 1 content stored in the floating action button. In fact, even in Gmail, when you think about Gmail and those little previews, we're used to the idea of Gmail as an email application being an email application. But when you first go and visit that screen, the thing that really makes it apparent outside of the title of Gmail is the fact that you can compose emails, right? And there are different design paradigms in which floating action buttons are used. In this case, this is obviously primary information because this is a navigation application, but floating action buttons can also pop up in terms of like those chat windows or advertisements and things like that. So when you're talking about the accessibility value of a floating action button, you have to make sure you take into account how informative that piece of information that the floating action button represents is. In the case of Gmail, for example, I would argue that the title of the app, Gmail, presents well enough that it's an email application that focusing that floating action button early on in the hierarchy is not important. Because the compose email action can be performed in other ways within Gmail. But could this information in this view, the way I have it marked up, that is absolutely true. That being said, there are a lot of different ways to solve this problem, right? So within this application, without a redesign, that navigation icon is absolutely class 1 information, and putting it at the bottom of that accessibility hierarchy is absolutely a mistake. That being said, there is some technical challenge in maintaining that. And so when we're talking about how do we fix this situation, we do not have to fix that by putting the floating action button and injecting it right at the top of that accessibility hierarchy, right? The ideal focus order being Cedar Point and then the navigation icon. There are other ways to do that. We can talk about those later. In its current state, how important is the FAB? The FAB is class 1 information. The FAB is exceptionally important information within this particular view hierarchy. And there are other ways we could do that, but without a design change, this floating action button is class 1 information. In fact, I would argue that it is more important than the title Cedar Point, right? How many people listening, think to yourself, knew that the title of this was going to be Cedar Point when we exposed Millennium Force, Top Thrill, Raptor, Maverick, so on and so forth? I know that those are rides at Cedar Point. I'm sure a lot of people do, right? Nobody is going to know inherently that this is an app that helps you navigate to those rides. So I would almost argue that within this particular application, in this particular use case, with this design, that the floating action button is actually the most important bit of information on the screen. Bonus, how are these items ordered? So when you look at these items, there's a spot where when you get off Millennium Force, so my path through Cedar Point every time is I go to Cedar Point, I hop off the Millennium Force, and then plan the rest of my trip through the park, and this is kind of the order in which the next top rides appear from that location. So I can loop back through Millennium Force, I can go to Top Thrill, which isn't too far away. Otherwise, I start the rest of the list. So. All right, so relating to accessibility, where does this attention go first, right? So we talked about this in terms of information, right? But let's talk about this in terms of visual, right? So as a cited user, when I open up this view, it's going to depend on your habits and depend on who you are. But for me, as a cited user, those fabs and the way that modern applications are using that design idiom, my attention goes to the fab first. I kind of go, hey, let's look at the different things that are floating around the screen. And that's probably me as a Facebook. I use that Facebook kind of the navigation, the chat heads. I use the Facebook chat heads. So I will admit that my attention is immediately attracted to those floating things. But I'm sure that's true for a lot of other users as well, right? And so as a cited user, my attention goes to this floating action button right away. That's the first thing that I see. And so back when we were talking about, in this particular instance, that floating action button being class 1 information, mobile app developers and companies that really focus on design, when they use this pattern, they know that. They are making those fabs. These fabs are getting bigger and bigger. I don't know, the Gmail fab, it used to be kind of like a little 48 by 48 pixel on the bottom of the screen, something that was kind of like an optional, yeah, use this. It's a convenience. And now it's almost double that size. And it's become like a primary interface component. And so my attention goes to those right away. So when we're talking about not just about the importance of the information, but in fact, where attention actually goes, when you have a fab that is this big, I would argue that the attention order, the order in which a cited user discovers items on screen naturally, is navigation icon, the Cedar Point heading, and then the individual rides. Moral of the story, no matter how we look at it in this case, whether it's from a user attention perspective or an information ordering perspective, the fab is class 1 information with this view in its current state. You can't deny that. We can make the icon smaller, so that isn't true from an attention grabbing perspective, but then we would have to change the way that the headings read, and that we get into all sorts of different solutions, and we can talk about those in a little bit. So how do blind users see this app, right? So now that we've talked about the way sighted users see this app and the organization of information, let's talk about the way blind users see this app. So this is, if I were to turn on TalkBack and allow it to go through and just do this thing where it just reads through the entire screen, kind of, as this announcement's done, I swipe right and focus the next thing. This is the way TalkBack is going to read that. It's going to start and say, Cedar Point, Millennium Force, Top Thrill, Raptor, Steel Vengeance, Gatekeeper, let's see, Gemini, Mean Streak, Blue Streak, Iron Dragon, blah, 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 blah. You know, however many roller coasters there are at Cedar Point. And then finally, navigate to probably the nearest item, the one at the top of the list, or whatever user interface design paradigm we want to use here. Maybe we click maybe one of these is active and we navigate to it. Idea being, a TalkBack user is essentially never going to naturally discover what this application actually does. And maybe we could fix this by making some of these actionable. There's lots of solutions we can do, but in its current state, a blind user is going to be very confused about the actual purpose of this application. And so how should an AT see this app? We could talk about all sorts of solutions. The solution that I would propose for this particular design, if we didn't want to change anything about the way the text is, we don't want to make any of the individual cells active, so on and so forth. The thing I would change about this design is I would have an assistive technology see this app. When I say assistive technology and see, that's going to mean different things for different technologies, right? So the way TalkBack sees an app is by reading it sequentially. The way Switch Control sees an app, it's by focusing things in the order in which they are interacted with. The way a keyboard sees an app is, again, focus order, so on and so forth. So the way an assistive technology should, quote, see this application is Cedar Point, that navigate to floating action button, and then the list of rides. And this makes it so that it's apparent. And also it matches the visual order, or at least the visual order that I imagine a designer would want. Meaning, let's see the application title, look at this global action that I can perform, and now interact with the individual elements within that list. So let's talk about some of the other solutions that we could explore to this problem, right? And when you're talking to like mobile developers and I'm going to dismiss all of those kinds of emotional feelings that people have about floating action buttons. There's a lot of people that are really strongly against floating action buttons as a design pattern, and a lot of people that are really for floating action. I don't care. I don't care. Let's talk about the accessibility implications and the various solutions that are available, and leave that to the designers, right? As developers, we're going to implement what we are handed. And so within this view as it looks, I really do think that this is the best solution. It shares context. There's a lot of reasons for that, right? There is a global action that needs to be performed, this navigate to, that in its current state cannot be performed in another way. This is also level 1 information. So going Cedar Point to this global action, which if it's also a heading is convenient because then you can swipe back up to that global action at any time. And then you go down and engage with these individual elements, right? Another thing we could explore, this navigate to thing and this kind of floating action button paradigm allows us to explore global actions and attract attention to a bit of functionality. But what we could do is we could say, okay, let's change this Cedar Point heading to navigating Cedar Point, right? So instead of quote Cedar Point, we say navigating Cedar Point. And so by saying navigating Cedar Point, we have included that class 1 information. We have delegated this class 1 information to completely unimportant, right? This button, just by saying navigating Cedar Point instead of Cedar Point, we have dismissed the value of this navigation icon as information. It helps us remember. It's still a little bit contextual, but it's no longer as critical to the nature of this application as it was before, right? So by swapping Cedar Point to navigate Cedar Point, the job that this action button is now performing, rather than being informative, is now just allowing people to perform that action. And so the other thing we could do is, instead of, okay, let's say that we went with my make one of these active and then navigate to it things. What if we just had all right, so you select once, you make it active, maybe this announced some information about it, and then you select that same one again and you navigate to it, right? There's an alternate way to perform that action, in which case you actually wouldn't have to focus the floating action button at all within an assistive technology. Now, there are reasons that I don't like that solution. The accessibility expert in me goes in and says, separate isn't really equal, and what about partially sighted users and users that are using switch control and have to go through and they are confused as to, oh, I can perform that secondary action? That's weird. I didn't know that was a thing, but they would figure it out, and you could do some like one-time announcements to help people discover that those secondary actions are available. But still, separate is not always equal, and you got to be really careful exploring these things that separate the assistive technology experience from the non-assistive technology experience. But that would be, I guess, what I would call an accessibility compliant solution. The other solution, and this is going to kind of leave the design of this particular application, we're going to leave that in the dust a bit, and let's say that instead of being a navigation icon, this were a chat icon. And I've delivered this chat a couple times, and the feedback I got on that was a general agreement from the blind people in the audience of yes, those chat things are annoying. I never want to engage with them. I understand, but sighted users are annoyed by them as well. And again, separate is not equal. And those chat things exist for a business purpose, right? So if the business purpose, for example, is advertisement, or if the business purpose is to, let's say that chat thing, while not generally needed, let's picture an insurance application, right? And an insurance mobile app where that floating action button is going to connect you to some like help support thing, right? Sure, for the people that don't appreciate interacting with applications and people in that way, that is annoying. But those little chat fabs at the bottom, those exist for a reason. Those exist because there is a section of the market of people that enjoy collaborating in that way. And so in that instance, that chat icon is actually still very important, if not annoying. To me, I'm annoyed by those chat things. I want to talk to as few people as possible. Give me documentation that I can Google and search and figure out my problems for myself. But there are people that want to have that chat, that want to have that engagement, and assuming that all of your AT users do not want that engagement because it's annoying or verbose is also not really fair. And so that's, again, a thing where separate is not equal. I am annoyed by those stupid little chat things, and so is the next sighted person, and so are blind people, and those are annoying, but we're all equally annoyed, and we all have equal access to that. So when that you have that hypothetical AT user that wants to chat with somebody, it should be available to them. And you can't have that separation of just because this is annoying to most users, so I'm just going to leave it out of my accessibility hierarchy and forget that functionality is there. That is a non-solution. That is not good. And there's a lot of other things we can do. We can do things like one of the another proposed solution is, all right, so let's do the navigate to Cedar Point heading, but let's replace this icon with some other way of performing that action. Maybe you could hit the volume button and perform some type of global action, or a special like swipe back and forth gesture. As long as there are other alternative ways of doing that, and they're not connected to, like, for example, the ability to like shake your device. Is a way you could perform actions, but not everybody can shake their device, right? So as long as there's some thought into how you perform those actions alternatively, this idea of navigate to Cedar Point as the navigating Cedar Point as the heading, and alternate ways of performing those actions, those are also all perfectly viable solutions. So real quick, one of the things that I'm big on now is empathy-driven development. If you haven't seen my empathy video, go back and watch it. But basically, the idea behind empathy-driven development is developers and designers sometimes get into this thing where somebody says that something isn't accessible, and so their solution is to go in, play around with TalkBack, and make it so that they can use it in TalkBack, whether that's a redesign or a redevelop. And that's what I call sympathy-driven development. It's helpful, and there are some accessibility problems you can solve by doing that. But a lot of accessibility problems require a degree of understanding and empathy. And the best way to get empathy is not to open up TalkBack yourself, but rather, okay, this person is telling me, this blind person is telling me that this isn't accessible to them. Let me go to that person, or at least let me go and do some research with some other blind individuals and see why this isn't the case. Because otherwise what you end up doing is you end up creating things that work for you, but that ultimately don't solve the real problem. And I think this floating action button thing is a good example of a place where we can apply empathy-driven development in order to help us make our lives easier. So for example, that those myriads of solutions that we talked about, if you don't have empathy for how someone wants to interact with the information in your particular example, your particular use case for a floating action button, there's no way you're going to pick the right solution. There's too many solutions out there, and you need to have that understanding, and you need to go do that research to understand, how does this floating action button, is this floating action button primary information? Is it a global action that can be performed? Is it an annoying advertisement? What value are people getting from this thing? Because sometimes users can get value from things in ways that we don't understand. In the case of this, if you want to just apply a blanket solution and you don't have the resources to go out and do that research, a super safe solution is to focus the fab before any element on the screen except for maybe the title. that is going to tend to annoy talkback users, but it's going to annoy talkback users just as much as it annoys regular users, right? No matter what kind of fab you have, mobile users have been trained to have that be the first thing that they look at. And so while not perfect solution, it indeed answers all of the scenarios that I can think about for floating action button use. Putting that fab as the second or third focusable item on the page, maybe title, primary heading, fab, or title, fab, primary heading, I don't care. The point is, it's really easy to inject that early on. Before we get into like things like list elements, it's really easy to inject that fab early on in the accessibility hierarchy, and then you basically cover all of your bases on those solutions. The other one that is almost safe, but only in certain situations, is to not focus the fab ever. Ensure that your heading contains context. Your fabs can be supplying context you are not aware of, and provide a clear alternate mechanism for that action. I share this really hesitantly. You got to be super, super careful when you use this solution. And this could also be damaging to the ecosystem as a whole. But these are our two solutions that you can apply to basically every scenario. And so that's it. That's all I have for the topic. Quick calls to action: download Axe for Android from the Google Play Store. We have some open source libraries that are coming soon. iOS is coming soon. Axe Android is out. Visit us, star us on GitHub. Also a great way to communicate with mobile development here at DQ. If you have any office hours ideas, please let us know. I have, I think, the next one covered. But after that, I am going to start I'm going to start being a sympathy-driven webinar person. I am going to assume that you guys have problems that need answered and try and go out and maybe do some Google searching for those problems, whereas I would much rather solve the problems that you in the audience have and have one of yours addressed specifically. So please, if you have ideas, let me know. Otherwise, let's open this up for Q&A, and I think I can view that here. So yeah, please, if you have questions, go ahead. All right, so we got one question. I'm going to kind of take a little second to read through the questions as they come in, and then maybe rephrase them a bit for you to make sure that they're technically kind for everyone in the audience. So just give me a second here. All right, so we have a question here about traits on custom components. How to choose traits on custom components? Should the trait always be none? Especially given that hints in iOS can be turned off. Okay, so there is a pair of complicated questions in there. So how do we choose traits on custom components? Traits should never be none on custom components. Don't or at least should certainly not always be none. In fact, you could almost always use the static text trait, although the static text trait, the purpose of the static text trait, for example, is to take a view that would normally be editable and communicate that it is not. So the static text trait doesn't really do much. You could almost always apply it, but unless the time when you could not apply the static text trait is if you have an editable view that is actually editable. That'd be the only time that static text trait does the wrong thing, right? And every other case is just going to be silent, right? But in general, consider your component. Right, so anytime we're talking about iOS accessibility traits, the thing that comes to mind is ARIA roles, right? And so when you're looking at ARIA roles, there's a really big expressive list of roles. And I see the question at the end here, especially given that hints in iOS can be turned off. And it sounds to me like you're trying to use hints to replace the thing that roles are. Let me be super clear about something real quick. The announcement of a particular trait is essentially meaningless, at least meaningless in comparison to the other things that come along with that trait, right? So let's talk about a really big kind of important ARIA role for the web and why it doesn't need to exist in mobile, right? So let's talk about menus. Menus and ARIA. When you go into the web, you can mark something up as a menu. And what a menu is, a menu tells the assistive technology that, hey, there is some type of expressive navigation that can be applied to this, right? And so you go into your keyboard and you start hitting the arrow keys all around, and it changes the way NVDA or VoiceOver or any assistive technology interacts with that thing, right? So when you apply the trait of menu, you get this changed behavior as well as the announcement of, hey, this is a menu, right? But that announcement of something as a menu is very unimportant. It much less important than the ability for a user to go around and interact expressively with what has been marked up as menu and menu items, right? So the announcement of, hey, blind user, this is a menu, isn't particularly meaningful. I think of it in terms of sighted, of being a sighted user, right? When you come across, when you see the first thing at the top, right, and you're in here, and like so for example, we have this file, edit, view, insert, format, slide, arrange, tools, add-ons. Do you need the visual context to know that I just read off menu items to you? No, that's the same menu that exists in every desktop application in the world. File, edit, view come first in every reasonable text editor type of thing out there, right? We don't need to visually see that as a menu, but what we expect is that when we click on these things, we get some drop downs and we get some nested navigation, right? And so when you mark this thing as the role of a menu, you're not telling the assistive technology to speak this as a menu. You're telling the assistive technology that this expressive navigation exists. And the assistive technology isn't telling a blind user that that's a menu because it needs to tell them that's a menu. That should be available from context. From the fact that it's early on in the view hierarchy, from the fact that it says file, edit, view, from the fact that it's right below the title of the document. All of that is what tells someone that this is a menu. The fact that that thing is marked ARIA role of menu, yeah, we can add that context and make it super clear, but really what we've made super clear is that this particular item here is a thing that we can click and explore expressively, is a thing that an assistive technology user can hit spacebar on or hit the down arrow on, and that will expand a more hierarchical navigation, right? So now let's bring this back to iOS traits. Accessibility hints are not a replacement for traits. In fact, accessibility hints should essentially never be used. They can provide valuable context here and there when you think your control is complicated enough such that the controls around it do not convey that context. When I think that the thing that I like to use accessibility hints for is like correlating information, right? So if you have a table view and you want to say that this thing belongs to this element, okay, that's something that if I were a power user of this application, a power voiceover user, I would remember that column 3 as I'm swiping across. Column 3 is that column. And so I don't need that hint. I don't need that heading because I'm used to, all right, my bank account information always comes in balance, recent transaction amount, name, and then account, right? And it's actually probably reversed, right? I'm thinking about my actual banking application. It's actually probably account name, recent transaction, balance. But you get the idea, right? You start learning, oh, hey, this is the order that this information comes in. And so something like the heading of a table, so it doesn't say Chris savings account. I don't need the hint of this is my account name. I don't need that accessibility. Maybe the first time I do, but so when I go to my Chase Bank and Chase app and it says, all right, Chris savings account, last transaction minus $100, current balance $500. I don't need current balance $500 every time. I don't need to hear that, right? Because after a while, I'm going to get used to the fact that that last number that gets announced is my balance. And so that is an excellent use case for an accessibility hint. What is not a use case for an accessibility hint is a custom component to say, okay, here's a button, and let's say that I want to take my account balance and I want to explore that account balance, right? And so as I'm going in that cell and I say, okay, let me explore my account balance, one of those things is going to be a button, right? And so I'm going in, I'm in VoiceOver, and I'm swiping, and I hear Chris McMeeking savings account button, right? Comma button. And that comma button thing is there, and there's a pause, right? That is not a good use for an accessibility hint. If I had that custom component, what I would want to do is mark that thing up as a trade of button, because what a trade of button means is that I can interact with that thing. And I can double tap and expect it to do something. I can turn the rotor and go into controls mode and swipe through all of the controls. I can turn on my braille board and say, go to the next button. I can turn on switch control and say, hit the next active component, right? That's what traits do. Traits say this thing requires interaction, and these different assistive technologies that need to interact with the thing need that trait. The accessibility hint of button is not going to tell switch control that thing's a button. The accessibility hint doesn't mean butt kiss to switch control or to tab navigation or to anything else. What it will do is it will announce information to an assistive technology user, to a VoiceOver user, hey, this thing's a button. That's ultimately not helpful. Because the trait of a button does that, and so much more. All right, so that was a really long answer. Sorry about that. Question 2, hint verbs matching label verbs. Is this considered too repetitive? Hint verbs matching label verbs. I'm honestly confused why you would have a verb in a label at all. And why you would need any hint verbs to begin with. If you need verbs in your labels and in your hints, you're likely lacking context within your application, likely lacking proper roles, right? The idea of verbs needing to be added in hints is something that comes from that empathy-driven development versus sympathy-driven development. Hint verbs come from developers who are exhibiting sympathetic developer behavior. They go in and they want to know all sorts of contextual things about the way they did, because they get it from that context, and they're assuming that a blind user does not get that information and get that context from the thing. The thing that an empathetic developer realizes is that blind users consume verbal information and structure in ways that we are not able to comprehend. We as sighted individuals are not able to comprehend. And so when you're going in and you're digging in and you're listening to VoiceOver and you're focusing on that button and you're seeing that thing in VoiceOver in your mind and it doesn't announce as whatever. Unless that is a role that makes sense, unless that is on those list of base accessibility traits for iOS, and those base accessibility traits are things like a button, link, and I think, by the way, button and link are basically the only ones that iOS has available that represent interactivity. We can talk about the difference between button and link in a second. Is active, is enabled. These are the things that convey kind of what the control does and basic stateful information. If it doesn't fit within there, it may belong in the accessibility hint sometimes. Again, be careful. They're not often helpful. And it may just be that you as a sighted individual do not understand how much context a blind individual gets from their understanding of the structure and ordering of information in that page. And if you are watching a blind user use your application and they're struggling to understand it, maybe you have a data and focus ordering issue, not an issue that needs to be solved by having an abundance of information in an accessibility hint or verbs in your labels. I basically would recommend, unless the verb needs to be available visibly, I would almost think that it that it doesn't belong in the label either. Times where I think that might be interesting or misleading. Let's say, for example, we have a music playing app, right? We have a music playing app, and we have songs, and we want to suggest that the buttons in a songs are going to be played, right? And so we're scrolling along this music playing app, and we see at the top. At the top is the word Google Play Music, right? And I that's the one I use, so I'm using it. I'm not picking on Google here. I use Google Play Music all the time, right? And so as a blind user, when I see Google Play Music at the top, when I see I don't know, a good Queen, so We Will Rock You, right? So I've seen Google Play Music at the top. I've seen We Will Rock You, and I hear that it's a button. I know that that's gonna play We Will Rock You. I just do. I can't separate myself from the need for having the word play repeated over and over. All right, so let's say that I'm a blind person going through a list of Queen songs, right? And I say, play We Will Rock You, play Rock and Roll Band, play Kansas, play Boston, play this, play that, play. Not necessary. Not necessary at all. It should be obvious from the context of your application that this is an app that plays music, and when you come across the song in an app that plays music, what do you think is going to happen? And so my answer to the verbs thing is verbs aren't needed. And maybe if you want to, you could add that as a hint, right? That's maybe where that hint comes in is append plays music to the end. And the importance of that being in the hint is the way that is then going to read is We Will Rock You, pause, plays music. Yeah, that makes sense. That's good. We have delayed that repetitive information, that thing where we were like, play We Will Rock You, play rock and roll band, play, right? We've avoided that problem. That's really redundant and annoying. And we've deferred it to the hint, in which case it's delayed. In fact, you can shut it off, right? As a power user of the Google Play Music application, I don't need to know that these things play music. I am comfortable with my ability to understand all of those things, and so I just shut hints off. I'm used to voiceover. I'm used to, in fact, think of accessibility hints as a thing to help new blind users discover applications and discover how to use voiceover. Somebody recently lost their sight, and when you think of accessibility hints as a way to help that person, it can be clear how hints should be used. An HTML language dropdown should have a language and a tray of button with no hint. Yep, absolutely. Earl, you are absolutely correct. Awesome questions, by the way. Sorry, I'm rambling on these questions because they're really, really deep, interesting questions. Is there a beta available for the Axe iOS app? No, there is not a beta available, but we will have things out, I think sometime in June is when those are all coming out. So it's right around the corner. Like I said at the beginning, we'll be announcing all of that stuff at the next office hours, if not have it available to you. So anybody else? What is, I see some questions in chat. Laura, have you been following chat? And is there anything I should address in there? I've been looking at the
yeah, I think maybe you could address like what is ARIA for those native mobile developers who
ARIA, yes. Okay, so ARIA, when think of so when you're dealing with a native Android or a native iOS application, you have the ability to create views, and you can go in and manipulate those views, and when you're manipulating views, you're largely dealing with things that are reflected on screen. And so then what you do is you go into, let's use iOS, for example, into the accessibility APIs, things like accessibility label, accessibility hint, traits. That's an accessibility API. At that point, you are directly manipulating the information that an assistive technology gets, right? And so when you construct an iOS or an Android view, an iOS view constructs this accessibility element that corresponds with an iOS view. In Android, you create an Android.widget.view, and a corresponding accessibility node info is also automatically created. But that doesn't mean that that information is right? And let's say, for example, in the custom component example, awesome questions, by the way. In the custom component example, that information is inevitably going to be constructed incorrectly. And so what you do is you go in and you manipulate the accessibility node info information, or you manipulate the iOS trait information. What ARIA represents you have a DOM element, and you have the ability to go into that DOM element and play around with its accessible representation, instead of playing around with the DOM element. And that's what ARIA is. ARIA is the Web Accessibility API. And I'm going to spell it here. It is ARIA. Notice the all caps. That is what ARIA.
Thanks, everybody, for attending. Thanks for those great questions. Great job, Chris, on the presentation. I hope everyone has a great rest of their afternoon.
Yeah, thank you, everybody.